G'day guys. This video we're looking at protein restriction and the effects, the negative effects of protein restriction in young age. So this is an animal model. We definitely can't do experiments on little children, but it's just the way it is. So let's get stuck into it. Still a mammal. Humans are still mammals. So has applicability, and it is related back to our dear friend taurine. And let's not forget taurine, as I've explained before. Wonderful. So I've explained before, taurine is an osmolyte that goes way back to the early beginnings of life on this planet. So it's applicable in that regard. Now, we'll look at the actual rat. This is the rat. I'll just show you here. There's the rat. Wistar rat. It's an albino type rat. So that it's its weight. And it usually lives between 22 and 28 months. So we just can actually have a perspective. Now, this study is looking at 12, let me just go back here, 12-day-old pups. So just so we can have a bit of a perspective on what we're talking about. So 12 days. So we're looking at going to do it at the because it's like for us about 75 to 82. So 80 divided by 82 times 28. It's about 27. So we'll do it on 27 months. So we've got an approximate, 27 times 30.5. That's the amount of days. Divided by, in terms of days, is that percentage. So we'll go for 80 years. So we're looking at 1 year times 12. So 1 and 2 months. So about 14 months. So 14-month child equivalent of 12 days for the human and the rat. Now let's just work out the other stuff. Now the intervention is for 16 weeks, but they actually are actually collecting data at baseline at 8 weeks and 16 weeks. So let's just get a perspective on this. So 8 times 7 divided by times 80. So that's about nearly 5.5 years. So minus 5 times 12. So about 5 months. So approximately 5 years and 5 months, or 10 or 11 years. So let's say 5.5 years to basically 11 years in human type length of time. So we've got a bit of a sort of an approximation. Obviously, their metabolic rate is different than ours and much faster, so they die much quicker. And there's a whole lot of other issues why you can't do that exact equivalent. So this is an approximation, so don't get your knickers in a knot. Anyway, the impact of taurine supplementation on the blood pressure of gestational protein restricted offspring, effects on the medial solitary tract nucleus cell numbers, so brainstem, and the angiotensin receptors in your kidneys, and renal sodium handling. How well do the kidneys handle those electrolytes? So they're only looking at two electrolytes, potassium and sodium. So the current study considers the changes in postnatal brain cell numbers and angiotensin receptors by maternal protein restriction and taurine supplementation and its impact on arterial hypertension development in adult age. So they will actually see an increase in blood pressure that does take place. And they are making the case for that it's protein restriction in very early age that seems to have this effect. It probably does explain a lot why when we flipped the diet with the guidelines back in the 70s, and we moved from a diet that was predominantly animal-based and seasonal starch and seasonal fruit. So it ended up being 2/3 animal-based, 1/3 plant-based. And we switched it over, and basically now it's nearly 70% plant-based, if not more in some cases, that we've reduced the certain types of, the level of quality protein, got proteases, inhibitors basically in a lot of the plants and stuff like that are basically restricting how much protein you can actually extract them anyway. Plus on top of that, very little, with all that kibble that people are eating nowadays, very little high quality protein. That's a problem. And especially when a lot of this is being done with younger children, and we've got meatless Mondays and veganerized Fridays and all that are happening around the world now, in especially developing countries, which are hell bent on basically making sure that their young people are undernourished, you could say malnourished basically. And with all this, restriction of animal-based foods, we're seeing even further reductions, and these are going to cause consequences down the track. We've already, in the last, 50 years, we've pretty much caused a lot of these issues. We're just going to exacerbate this problem if we continue down this path. Method and results. The brain tissue studies were performed by immunoblotting, put that on that little glass thing, immunohistochemistry, and isotopic fractional analysis. The current study shows that elevated blood pressure associated with decreased fractional urinary sodium excretion, and we'll look at that, in adult protein deprived offspring, was reverted by a diet taurine supplementation. Also, that 12-day-old protein restricted pups present a reduction of 21% of brain stem neuron counts. So we're talking about 21%. I wonder what problems that's going to cause, peripheral neuropathy, all sorts of other problems in regards to the proper functioning of your nervous system and your brain in general, shrinkage, as we know, vaginarized shrinkage, I call it. And so that's what they actually noticed. This is, protein restricted. These were not even fat restricted. So, and then I always remind people, what's your body made of? Your body's made of basically protein and fats. It's not made of fiber. Okay. It's not made of little flowers. And it's not made of honey. It's made of protein and fat and it's an animal-based protein and fat. So that's should basically be indicative of what even other animals in nature, they will use certain different types of digestive approaches to basically extract and acquire those two essential elements that they require, the fats and cholesterol plus protein. They'll get it different ways. You know, I mean, a cow has 3 chambers where it basically slowly grows these little organisms, you know, protozoa and everything else, and bacteria and all the other types of things. They grow and they feast on the fiber. That fiber gets shot out in the back and it goes into the 4th chamber, which is an acidic chamber. And those little organisms get absorbed. That's the protein of fat. So it gets short chain fatty acids, which are saturated, plus all these long chain fats and of different types, including some polys, some monos, and a number of other long chain saturates that are basically absorbed from digesting these little organisms that grew and feasted on the fiber. So really, what is a cow? It's a carnivore. You know, hindgut fermenters like the gorillas, you know, all that fiber goes into that big cecum. Well, ours is an appendix, so you can forget about trying that little trick at home. You know, you're not going to go very far of getting very much from fiber, but they do. They get a lot of protein and all that because they can actually break down that cellulose inside there and can feast and actually extract proteins and fats from that fiber. Plus, they eat a number of varieties, because some of the varieties are basically have more fat in them and some varieties have less fat, and these are termites. They still eat a lot of termites as well. And that's how all animals, they'll use different strategies, but at the end of the day, we use hunting strategies, you know. And we also basically, you know, learn to basically make little stone tools so we can way more efficiently break bones and extract the bone marrow and, you know, and cut those basically, you know, nice big burgers off those ruminant animals. And that's basically, you know, how we basically did it with the big steaks. Our steak knife was a sharp stone, but it did the trick. And every animal finds a strategy. Even you know, I did a video ages ago talking about the, you know, this is in one of my playlists that I did with Bart. Just go and check it. I've done on on a number of chimps that have basically found themselves where humans have cleared the actual forest and now they're in a savanna region. Guess what they do? They congregate together. They're cooperative. They're less vicious towards each other. They are more helpful to each other, and they hunt together with their own little spears. You know, and it's called the savanna chimps or something like that. And not only that, chimps in the wild hate water. These guys actually sit in water in water holes to cool down, like our ancestors would have. You know, and they still haven't evolved out of the chimp thing, but already, you know, they've upregulated their sort of simple, you know, those sort of genes that basically, you know, make them more cooperative. And they're developing tools to basically hunt. They didn't go looking for any tubers. They went for these to create spears. That was the first thought. How do I get high quality food? You know, tells you everything. Tells you bloody everything when you see that sort of stuff. But anyway, I'll put that down there. And the other one I'll put up there, which is the one with the big, you know, the rats on high protein grew these big, massive kidneys. So you want to fix kidneys? It's get some steak into you, mate. Get some steak into you. Pretty much what it is. So that's those two locations. So let's get into it. So we're basically looking at over this sort of period. So we're looking at excretion rates, and we're looking at you know, that's excretion rates, and then we're looking at reabsorption. So also we're looking at the actual cells reduction numbers, high blood pressure in the progeny. So with the high blood pressure levels found compared to, so they saw that change in blood pressure. And they also, these were age matched. So just a reminder up here that there was blood pressure associated with the decreased fractional urinary the excretion. So we'll see that shortly. So there's a panel A and a panel B. So let's just go here. Panel A is 8 weeks. Panel B is 16 weeks. So think in human terms, 5.5 years, 11 years. So we're looking at creatine clearance, fractional sodium excretion. So the excretion you put out in the urine in that regard, the proximal sodium, which is the reabsorption, and also the post proximal, that means after that reabsorption stage. And that's the, so you've got the, also we're looking at the, so those are the other, those other sort of percentages, and then and that's all to do with the sodium side, these three. So just remember, the first one is the urine excretion. The second one is the sort of the reabsorption, and that is the number of the post after the reabsorption. Okay, and then we've got basically the potassium. Okay, so we've got 3 groups: the control, NP, the protein restricted, LP, and the taurine protein restricted. So obviously we need a control, one that is not affected, and then 2 other groups that are basically being protein restricted up to 12 days, which is the equivalent of a child being 14 months, being completely, and then intervening at that 14-month period, intervening for 5.5 years, and then so you can actually see that it doesn't take long. So if a child is deprived from at birth, you know, is deprived with poor quality protein, which means if you're a mother and let's say you can't breastfeed, if that child gets a soy formula, which has got protease inhibitors that basically, you know, prevent that child from actually being able to absorb high quality protein, and it's, you know, you're depriving that child. So within 14 months of the child's life, that child is going to have much lower capacity to deal with a number of these things, let alone will have brain shrinkage. Okay, that's not a good thing. You're supposed to be growing a bigger brain. You put these people that are doing these sort of things are setting up their children for a lot. It's probably the reason for the explosion we've seen in even in the general community, where, you know, people are nearly plant-based, even in the general community, and their children are having all these poor quality formulas. It's probably one reason why we've seen this explosion in autism and all these other conditions. It's not surprising. I mean, we're down to, if you go back in the past, it was 1 in hundreds of thousands. Then it got to the 70s and all that were consuming certain processed foods and all that. In some nations, it was 1 in 15,000 or 1 in 10,000 in the US. So, sorry, in the US, it was 1 in 15,000 in the latter part of the 70s. In the earlier part of the 70s, I believe it was actually lower at about 1 in 15,000. It transitioned through the 70s. And that was a similar period as the US moved further and further away from people started eating out far more often. And then it sort of exploded after in the 80s and onwards, which means they were getting poor quality food. So it's sort of indicative of that. And so we will look at the numbers. So the first one, remember. So here's the creatine clearance. It's improved slightly. And then we're looking at so this would be equivalent to 5.5 years, remember? So we're seeing slight improvement in excreting sodium. This may explain why some people go on a carnivore diet, have been on a veganurized diet for a very long time, have probably had some atrophy with their kidneys, and as a consequence, are having difficulty clearing out sodium, and their blood pressure comes down only slightly. And they're going, well, this isn't really working for me. Well, you may need to get yourself on taurine to get that sorted. And it may take a few years because you've basically allowed your kidneys to atrophy quite a bit. So here's the, when it comes to potassium, it pretty much restores within 5.5 years. Or for the little rats, it basically within their 8 weeks. So here's, so that's that figure there. Then we've got, this is the reabsorption. So that's marginally improved in that regard. And that is that post absorption, you're actually holding on to slightly more if you've got problematic. So that's actually slightly improved, but it's somewhere between the two. So it's slightly getting better in managing sodium. So we'll go to the 16. So here the creatine again, pretty much just as good. Now, when we see the urinary excretion, nearly about the same. Potassium, very similar. Again, the reabsorption, more or less very similar. And this the post-proxima, as you can see, it's nearly back to baseline or nearly back to the control, which is equivalent to 11 years. So what it's showing here is it will take you a decade, but you will get there. So if you persist on a carnivore diet, getting high quality protein in, your kidneys will improve. And I've seen that with Dad, because Dad's kidneys atrophied. They were, problematic. He had all these little polyps on them. We were worried about cancer. And, now that he's been on for a number of years, for half a decade only, we've seen a dramatic reversal. And also his blood pressure has come down. He was actually having difficulty getting his blood pressure down. And so, we were struggling on that front. And, his doctor was recommending, and I go, nah, that's not going to work. That masks the problem, doesn't fix the problem. So I had him on high protein, but I struggled with Dad. He still doesn't comply, so bad old boy. So I do have him on 6 grams of leucine, and I do have him on 4 sometime initially I had him on 6. He's down to 4 now, grams of taurine, and pretty much he's normalized his blood pressure, which is good. So his doctor's no longer talking about or bitching about, blood pressure meds anymore, because it's been sorted. So that problem's gone away, thanks to taurine, and thanks to this sort of research that I applied on Dad. So he was my experimental animal. Is the old boy is very good in complying in the end. I didn't have to cage him. It's really important. It could have been the problem, with the authorities if I caged the old boy. But it would have been for his own good. Well, in my personal opinion. So that was, we're going to look at the brainstem weight. As you can see, there's your control, 12-day-old. There's basically the atrophy. Look at the difference. Look at the difference that taurine makes. It's even above the control. That means the brainstem weight is actually better than the control. This is protein restricted rat, which has basically now got a better, heavier brainstem than the control. That's significant, the difference, in milligrams per 100 grams. That's quite a lot, in that regard. So we're not talking about small things here. So that's big improvements in that regard. The per brain stem, so the actual weight per brain stem is slightly better. So as you can see, even the actual individual is actually better. Obviously, the control is smidgenly, but even there, it's slightly, a bit above. So it's interesting in that regard. So this is the neural numbers. That means the actual numbers themselves. As we can see, there's your taurine. Definitely even above the actual. So you're actually getting, even if a child is basically, you've done the wrong thing, you can still reverse it, ladies. You can still reverse it. Give them bloody taurine and give them a big steak as well. Okay, I've overshot. Now let's look at systolic blood pressure. There's, you got one group, LP, our deprived, poor little thing, the LPT, and the control at the bottom. So that should have sort of blood pressure, which is fairly within the between 110 and 120. As you can see here, the other one's about 140 up here. Put in the taurine and you're knocking it back. It's not at the 120, all of them are slightly above, but it's a way better improvement than what existed, but it's still trending down, as you can see. So the longer you do it, yes, it'll take, remember you've got cellular turnover is about a decade. So in order to turn over cells in your whole body, it takes about a decade. So to rebuild, fix things and grow things and reset them and all that, it takes a while. So it may take 12, 13 years to get back into the normal range. So if you've been one of those children, especially nowadays, the future, we're going to see a bigger explosion in blood pressure problems throughout the community. It's growing exponentially, believe me. Every year, there are more people put on blood pressure meds. And the reason is because basically, protein deficiency, protein deprivement from young age, protein restriction, too long. If you're restricting protein for too long, something got to give, and so you'll see atrophy. We know that even if you do long fasts, you can see, and if you don't, especially, like the goons that are, some that have spoken to me and all that were basically ex-fruitarians and all that, they've got some of these issues. And they go, Harry, how do I fix this? And I usually put them on a supplemental regime of a lot of meat and leucine and taurine. And I usually put them on very high doses of taurine, sort of. Okay? Because we're trying to fix this a bit faster. So let's take a look at what some of these things look like. So here's your maternal protein restriction. Tracheocellular nucleus. So we're talking about within the brain stem. So when they cut these little things up, they put on a little glass thing, and then they basically observed it under a microscope. So there's your control, zoomed in. As you can see, that does not look anything like the control. But look at that. There's the protein restricted. See, pretty much the same as that. You're getting a lot of improvements and reversal of the initial damage. So now we're looking at these sort of, there's one there, but these sort of blots. And in the taurine one, you can hardly, there's probably one little there, but you can hardly see any. It actually does even better than the actual control. It improves. And we've seen that in some of the others, that it actually was higher than even the control in terms of the volume of the, the actual weight. So even the cells themselves, the neurons, were actually much better than even the control. But it was marginal. So statistically, not significant. Fine. A cell is a cell, you could say. But when we're talking about the weight, the actual volume, the volume was even better than the control, as you saw. And so it sort of explains why it looks a bit like this. So then they just basically go into their conclusions, blah, 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 blah. In conclusions, all through the precise mechanism responsible for the subsequent enhanced sodium retention response in LP offspring rats is still unclear. It's a protein deficient. How can you actually even say that? The current data suggests that maternal low taurine ingestion may lead to changes in NTS, cardiovascular and sympathetic nerve activity, and are conclusive to excess hydroelectrolytic tubule reabsorption, and thus this may potentiate the program of adult hypertension. Anyway, so those little tubules in the actual kidney, this raises the possibility that taurine during the gestational period may inhibit several other actions of angiotensin II through the regulation of an early step in the signaling pathway of angiotensin II. In fact, in the present study, it is plausible to suppose the association decreased NTS neuron cellularity, blah, 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 water electrolyte renal excretion with a higher blood pressure level found in LP taurine deficient progeny compared with age-matched NP and LPT offspring. The mechanisms by which the fetal programming causes these disorders remains unknown, and further studies are needed in this regard. Obviously, they always say that. We want more money to do more studies. Obviously, you do. But in my book, basically, the study itself has actually pointed clearly what the problem is. Protein deficient will cause, these problems. And the less protein you take in, the less you're going to take in taurine, because taurine, wherever protein goes, so does taurine. Taurine is part of protein. Part of animal flesh, of all animal flesh, is what taurine is part of. So if you eat less animal flesh, you will get less taurine. If you eat more animal flesh, you will get more taurine. So they go hand in hand. This sort of reductionist sort of let's separate the two. No, we showed it's this nutrient that does it. Yes, but we don't eat supplements. We eat, basically, humans never did. No species does. We do it. We get it with those foods. And the other thing is, while we do see improvements, and as I've pointed out, the reason for this is that taurine has a number of purposes. One, it regulates electrolytes. It's an osmolyte. It regulates the pressure within inside the cell. That's why it can actually, and also causes greater retention to the proper physiological homeostatic level of potassium and magnesium inside the cell. So they work better. And, especially for ATP synthase. Then you've got the other side of things, that taurine is basically having a direct effect on the protein synthesis. Two methods, two ways. One, it actually is an amino transporter. So it's actually, even from poor quality protein, it's going to get more of that poor quality protein inside as part of the amino pool compared to the lack of it. The second thing that it does, it is a mild myostatin inhibitor. So it inhibits myostatin slightly, which magnifies the protein synthesis effect of animal protein. It is a combination. This sort of reductionism, sort of annoys me. But the take-home message is, eat a steak, actually have 2 steaks or more, enjoy them. And, if you basically have been somebody who has deprived themselves for a very, very long time, you may have to have an intervention of some leucine and some taurine in order to sort of fix that problem, to basically accelerate the protein synthesis and increase the amount of, growth in those organs again. So if you want to have bigger kidneys that function much better and healthier, because most kidney disease, guys, is atrophied kidneys. Yeah, most, and this is the problem why blood pressure issues are going dramatically up. Low taurine, low protein diets are basically creating an army of blood pressure, victims, so, and it's great for business, but as the numbers escalate, it's not going to be sustainable in the long run. Eating a steak is a way better a better path to go. And if you've got basically elderly that you really struggle to try and get protein in them, your next best option is to try and encourage them to do a few eggs and some more dairy, fats, and proteins, and also at the same time trying to get a bit of leucine into them at least. Try and get in their 2 major meals 3 grams for each major meal of leucine, and at least getting in 4 grams of taurine, 2 and 2. 1 in their evening meal, which will help with their sleep as well, and sort of normalizing cortisol, which basically will increase their level of melatonin, which will also help them repair their mitochondria and repair their general tissue, because it is a reparative system in that regard. That's probably the take-home message. The take-home message for mums who are either pregnant or have young children, all that, get more meat into those kids is the take-home message. You don't want the atrophy, the brain atrophy. You don't want your children having blood pressure problems in the future. You don't want your kids basically having organ systems that are not fully well developed. You need to feed them the appropriate species, appropriate foods. If you do that, those children will grow and thrive and be the best they can be. So it's incumbent on you people to get the message out, to share this video, and to make sure people understand the importance of animal-based nutrition. And the more people remove it from their diet, the more they will suffer in the long run. And so will their children. Anyway, see yous.